When the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not another." Then the oil stopped flowing. She came and told the man of God, and he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest." So that's the word. So to break this down for you, we have the story of a woman whose husband has died. She has a need. There is a need in her life. She is owing, she is in debt, and the creditor, or the person she owes money to, wants to take her sons as slaves. So she asks for help from a prophet named Elisha. And he asks her what she has. She responds by telling him she has nothing in her house except for one jar of oil. Just one jar of oil. That's it. That's all she has left of value, of any significance. She's completely broke apart from this one jar of oil. Now, in her eyes, that doesn't seem like much or anything special. In her eyes, there's not much she can do with it. But Elisha saw differently. And it is evident in the way he responded to the need. You see, Elisha was a prophet of God. He didn't just know about God, he knew God. The things he encountered and experienced previous to meeting this woman are evidence that God is real in his life. Just chapters before, we read about him seeing water parted. We read about him seeing his predecessor, Elijah, taken up to heaven in a whirlwind. So Elisha didn't just know God by his actions, but he knew the character of God. That's why it makes sense as to why Elisha responded to the woman in a certain way. Now, when someone is lacking and they ask for help, rationally your response would be to give to them, right? Yeah, you give, help someone out. But what initially baffled me was what Elisha instructed her to do instead. He says, "Go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels and not too few. Then go in and shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels, and when one is full, set it aside." She was lacking. She was near broke. And yet what Elisha instructed her to do was to pour all that she had left into the vessels of others.
That's great.
And so to answer the first question, how do we accelerate? My point is this: pour out until you have nothing left.
Great.
Pour out until you have nothing left. Nikki Aben once said, "Unless you've given it all, you haven't given enough." Unless you've given it all, you haven't given enough. Something that I've taught to G-Fresh, and something that you will automatically discover as you journey deeper in your Christian walk, is that our life is one in which we must constantly pour out and be refilled, and pour out and be refilled, and pour out and be refilled. It's an ongoing process. A quote from Eric Johnson states this. He says, "We are designed to be a river of continual life." When we became believers, we were ushered into a continual flow of life. Now, a significant thing to note is that this woman in the story is a widow. She's certainly not rich. She was certainly not living in abundance. She was poor and in desperate poverty. Kat explained in her last message that as a widow, this woman was empty. She was destitute. She was lacking. She really didn't have much to give. But what we see is that in her lack, this woman, this widow, poured out all that she had left. In verse 5 to 6 it reads, "So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons, and as she poured, they brought the vessels to her. When the vessels were full, she said to her son, 'Bring me another vessel.' And he said to her, 'There is not another.' Then the oil stopped flowing." Within these few verses, we witness a miracle. And it's that from one jar of oil that she had left, she was able to fill the vessels of many neighbors until all their jars were full. She didn't have much, but miraculously, what she offered was able to fill the vessels of many. So we see here that in order to accelerate, in order to go above and beyond, we must pour ourselves out even when we feel like we have nothing or barely anything left to give, just like the widow did. Now, it seems like it doesn't make sense. It's not logical. How can I go above and beyond when I have nothing left?
Right.
It is such a paradox to go above and beyond that in order to go above and beyond, we would be required to give until we have nothing left. But the reason we do this is because it is when we come to the end of ourselves that God is the extension for our lack. When we come to the end of ourselves, God is then the extension for our lack. Accelerate means to go above and beyond. How is this made possible? If I can only go so far, then God is the extra. When you give your all, just like the widow did, somehow, miraculously, God makes up for your weakness, your shortcoming, your lack, and uses what you have to turn it into something more. That's what it looks like to accelerate, to go above and beyond. It is when God steps in and somehow gives you the ability to move beyond the normal, beyond the common, beyond the required. And the truth is, this woman did have something left. It wasn't much, but it was enough for God to use. And you may be sitting there thinking that you have nothing left to offer. But as long as you are alive, there is always something to give. And as empty or as lacking as that woman felt, she still had that jar of oil to give, and she poured it out. What is the oil that you pour out? What is this oil that I speak of that we can pour out? It's pouring out your convenience. It's pouring out your resources, pouring out your money, pouring out your service, pouring out your time, pouring out your heart, pouring out your energy, your thoughts, your wisdom, your experience, which may not seem like much to you, but when used by God can go a long way. As we pour into others, the others that we pour into it's the church, it's our ministries, it's our connects, it's our families, it's our schools, our friends, our workmates. It may not be much in your eyes, but based on God's principles and based on God's character, when you give what you have, as little as it may seem to you, there's a whole lot He can do with it. The widow had one jar of oil left. She willingly poured it out into the vessels of her neighbors, and somehow they were filled. I believe it is the exact same principle when God fed 4,000 people through 7 loaves, and when He fed 5,000 through 2 loaves and 2 fish and 5 loaves that were offered, and there was still left over. Understand, church, that we serve a God who loves to make up for our lack. He makes up for our lack. He takes us above and beyond what we cannot do on our own. Kat said, in our lack, God is able to fill it. And He's done it over and over again in the Bible, and to this day in my life and in this church, because He loves making up for our lack. He gets to be God. If we could do it all on our own, then what purpose does He have in our lives? But it takes a person or a group of people to pour themselves out so that others may witness the miracle power of God as He moves beyond what we could ever do on our own. An underlying factor in this principle, though, that you must understand is that in order for God to step in to take us above and beyond, we must first give up everything to be poured out. It is in that lies the key to accelerating, to going the extra, to going above the average, the standard, the normal.